are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
Rootbound is blossoming thanks to the magic of pollination. Bees, butterflies, bats, even the wind. They all play their part. Pollination, the birds and the bees of plants.
Pickles. Let's talk pickling. But first, thank you for listening. My name is Steve, and this is Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside. And each week, I invite a guest who joins me on the show to share with us all about a plant that means something to them. Then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me. And through this process, we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. Now, our guest today is going to talk about a specific vegetable that is often pickled. You probably know the one. But I would like to talk about pickling in general. It's a very interesting concept and something I've experimented with a little bit. But first, let's talk about that word. You know that I love, etymologies. And the word pickle comes from some kind of, Germanic or Low Dutch or something that I forget exactly. But it's in that Germanic family. And it's something like pekel or pukkel or pickle. And it referred to they say a sauce, but more like a liquid that you would, preserve meat in, I guess. So originally it referred to maybe brining meat to preserve it, in a really salty solution, which you can use to preserve meat. But then someone had the bright idea to use that same liquid with vegetables, and that's how we got pickled vegetables. They're vegetables put in the pickling liquid. And in fact, sometimes that liquid can be called pickle itself. So it's very interesting linguistic thing here that you could put vegetables in pickle to pickle them and then they become pickles. In fact, I was trying to figure out, is there anything else in English where when you perform the verb on something, when you pickle something, it becomes the noun form of that verb? So when you pickle a cucumber, it becomes a pickle. And I actually cannot think of any specific examples like that. And I was trying to Google around. I even asked some artificial intelligence, and I couldn't find any really great examples of that. Of when you perform the verb on something, it becomes the noun of that verb. The closest I got is when you ship something, it becomes a shipment. But this is more like you pickle something, it becomes a pickle. It's the same word. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon in English having to do with pickles. I think I've talked too much about pickles now. But let's meet our guest and hear her take on pickling.
That's a dilly of a pickle.
Hi, Audrey. Welcome to Rootbound.
Hi, Steve. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. Do you have a plant to share with us today?
I indeed do. I am here to talk to you about the cucumber, Cucumis sativus, and very specifically, the pickling cucumber.
So, admission here, if I think I like every food, but if I had to pick a food I don't like, it would be pickles. So
I am here to change your mind.
Great. And maybe. I feel like as I'm getting older, I feel like I'm getting more into pickles. Also, since I'm into plants and stuff and all these anyway, I feel like I'm turning the corner on pickles. But it's still if you had to say, hey, Steve, what food do you not like? Pickles would be the one, and it's been like that since I was a kid.
Well, I'll say when you make pickles yourself, they do taste significantly different than the store-bought ones. So maybe that'll be the thing that pushes you over the edge.
All right. Well, let's talk about it. First of all, why are cucumbers, specifically pickling cucumbers, meaningful to you?
Well, so I would say that my family, and especially my brother and I, have a bit of an obsession with pickles, and very specifically a type of pickle that we call Bindreiter pickles.
How do you spell that?
Bindreiter. You know what? I don't know, because it is actually named after a family friend of my grandparents, Rosie and Franz Bindreiter.
Oh,
I think it's
okay.
Bindreiter.
Oh, it's like a German name or something.
Yeah, so they actually immigrated to Ohio from Austria in the 1950s, and they lived in my grandparents' neighborhood, and my dad grew up with their kids and they were really wonderful friends to my grandparents for decades upon decades. And Rosie grew a very large garden, which I have this much very small memory of. My grandmother says it was absolutely fantastic, and she was a really prolific canner and preserver, and was very generous in sharing the things that she put up. So I have really fond childhood memories of bin-drieder pickles, which are actually a type of refrigerator pickle, not truly canned. But yeah, they're absolutely wonderful, and my family is obsessed with them, and now I make them.
And now, just to be clear, I think I understand this, but the bin-drieder pickle is like only a thing, I guess, in your family, and I guess maybe the bin-drieder family, or is it?
Yeah,
like,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
It's not like a very unknown classification that you might be able to pick up at like a weird farmer's market. It's like a totally
Correct.
Cool. That's very cool.
It has more to do with the recipe, which actually is really interesting. I think it's a little bit unique in terms of pickle recipes because it contains horseradish and turmeric in addition to like dill and garlic and peppercorns and some of the things that you typically find in pickles. So
Okay.
I set out to make it or to recreate it when I started growing a garden several years ago.
Okay, this is very interesting. I feel like I want to get back into some stuff about the plant first, but while we're
Sure.
on pickles, tell me about pickles. You've mentioned a few things. You mentioned like your typical pickle. You mentioned refrigerator pickles, not canned pickles. Just let's tell us about pickles.
Okay. Well, I would not claim to be an expert on pickles necessarily, but I do know that there are a couple of different kinds or different ways that you can preserve cucumbers in a pickling fashion. One of them is like a fermented, I think it's called lactofermentation, done sort of like sauerkraut or kimchi or any of those fermented. There are canned pickles, which have a very high vinegar content to them, and that's where the tang comes from. And then there are refrigerator pickles, which are not shelf stable, but are a version of vinegar-based pickles that have to be refrigerated all the time. But you sort of make a brine and pour the brine in with the cucumbers and a bunch of other stuff that you want to put in there, and then they infuse over a couple of weeks, and then they're delicious and keep for, in our experience, about a year if you can make them last that long in the fridge, which ours never do.
Interesting. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, yeah. Like, and so I've done a little bit of lactofermentation of other things, not cucumbers, because, as I said, that's not my favorite. And that's a really interesting process. But then, yeah, that pickling with vinegar, which is an interesting thing to think about, because when you do lactofermentation, you're kind of making a vinegar, like you're getting a sourness going on.
Yeah.
It's different bacteria, I guess, maybe acetobacteria versus lactobacteria, but yeah, then the canning process is you're probably just like pressure cooking a vinegar pickle, but instead of storing in the fridge, I guess, right?
Exactly. There's no canning process with the refrigerator pickles, which makes them like really easy for the beginner preserver to put up if you have an abundant harvest, which is great.
Yeah, totally. And like canning is a little bit intimidating to me. I've only done it once with my grama, and I always feel like I'm going to mess something up and give myself
like botulism. Yeah, right.
Yeah, so very good. Okay, well that's great. Well, then maybe before we get into the specific recipe of the bin-drieder pickle, let's talk about the plant. Like, what is your relationship with these pickles, and also maybe just some interesting, like, dazzling details and fun facts about cucumbers themselves. Like, I think it's one of those plants that people maybe take for granted as a garden plant. But I'm curious what you have to say about the
Absolutely.
cucumber.
Well, I did some digging specifically into the history, because I didn't know that much about the history of cucumbers, and I found out that they are native to India and have actually been cultivated for about 3,000 years, starting in Western Asia, and then sort of spread to Greece and Italy, and then made their way to England and France also. And actually, if you look back at the Latin name, cucumis means cucumber. It's derived from the Greek for cucumber, and then sativus is from the Latin that means that something that is sown. So it's very focused on like the agricultural uses and not so much the native uses of the cucumber. So I thought that was kind of fascinating.
That's come up a few times. The sativa, which sown or cultivated. A lot of those like really common garden plants have that specific epithet of sativus or sativum. So very interesting.
Yeah. And according to the University of Missouri, it's one of America's top 5 garden vegetables. And Americans eat, just kind of a crazy amount of them. We're said to consume 9 pounds of cucumbers per capita annually. So
Whoa.
right. And thinking about how like small cucumbers are and relatively light, that seems like a lot of cucumbers.
Yeah,
to
I
me.
guess, maybe they're on all burgers in the United States, which has been sometimes a bane for me.
True.
And then I guess there's other things. But yeah, I guess, I don't know. I like cucumbers. It's the pickling I'm not into. So I don't know if I eat 9 pounds, but I might eat my fair share.
Yeah, right. In terms of growing, there's a reason they're in the top 5. Like, they're fairly easy to grow. They perform best when they're trellised. They actually prefer to be direct seeded, which I think kind of bucks conventional wisdom. And I always start them indoors. So next year, I got to figure out how I can direct seed them into my garden, because I guess they don't like their roots being jostled so much. But there are 2 types of cucumbers, kind of loosely defined, slicing and pickling. And the one that I grow is called the National Pickling Cucumber. So that's the one
cool.
I've always grown. Mm-hmm.
Interesting. And then, how long have you been growing them? What's your relationship with growing them?
I think this is my 6th year growing them. And I started off with just 1 or 2 plants. This year I'm doing 9 plants, which kind of feels insane to me. Like, it's going to be so many pickles. But they're easy to give away because my family is really into them. And 2 years ago, I actually had some problems with a common pest called the cucumber beetle. And so my yields were like dramatically lower. So, not taking any chances this year and growing kind of an obscene amount.
One plant, how many cucumbers can you get from one?
Well, it depends on the variety. And it depends on how frequently you're picking them, because they're one of those plants that if you are continuously picking, they'll continuously produce. So I don't know that there's like a maybe experts have a average, but if you're picking regularly and if you have a really longer growing season, which like I'm in Ohio and our last average frost date is this week. I planted mine in almost 2 weeks ago, so I really was able to extend the growing season that way. They sort of respond well to babying, I think.
Interesting. I need to grow some cucumbers. I did 1 year in this house, and I'm starting to realize that maybe I'm not the best gardener. Like, the stuff that does the best is the stuff that's more perennial, edible stuff in my yard. Like, I just like tomatoes fail all the time. And I worry
tomatoes are trickier than people give them credit for, in my opinion.
Maybe that's it. So maybe I should try cucumbers at some point. I think I had a volunteer cucumber show up a couple of years ago, which was pretty interesting. I don't know where it came from. But that's a cucumber.
Do you compost? I bet it was the compost.
Maybe it was. Yeah, you're probably right. It probably was from the compost. Yeah,
I get squash plants almost every year from my compost. I don't know what kind they are, but I just plant them out and go have fun.
Yeah, very interesting. So do you have any other fun facts or dazzling details about the cucumber?
I do. So I learned in my research that pickles specifically can be found in 70% of all American households. So they are, quite prolific.
Yeah. I think even though I don't like them, my wife likes them. So we definitely have pickles in the fridge. So
there you go. Yeah. You contributed to that 70% then.
Indeed.
And there are some very atypical ways that you can use cucumber aside from, slicing and eating or pickling. I learned that pureed cucumber can soothe sunburn, kind of like aloe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I get that.
So I might be trying that this year, considering I'm very fair-skinned and prone to sunburn. It can also be rubbed on noisy hinges to lubricate them. I don't know the science behind it, but the internet told me so.
I'm going to look that up. We have a couple really noisy hinges
you go.
that because we just had a baby, are quite the detriment when she's sleeping and we open one of those noisy hinges. So
cucumbers to the rescue.
Yeah. I'm going to be slathering my door in cucumber. And yeah, I don't know if there's any other ill effects as far as over time, but that's a very interesting thing. I'm going to read more about that.
Well, and while you're at it, while you're, doing home improvement with cucumbers, I also read that they can remove tarnish and build up residue on faucets and sinks and stainless steel, because they are kind of a little bit corrosive, or the minerals in it are sort of eat away at some of that stuff. So yeah.
Wow. I was not expecting non-food uses for cucumber.
I tried to come with a wide variety, and I didn't know that you didn't like pickles, but I'm glad I did.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, even if I don't get into them, I still could use them, I guess. With a sunburn thing, that I guess it makes sense. You always think about those cartoons of people with cucumbers over their eyes.
Right.
So they do have, I guess, some kind of like skin
anti-inflammatory, right?
Effect.
Yep.
Yeah, interesting.
Yep. My last dazzling detail is that World Cucumber Day is June 14th. So we have about we have a reason to celebrate when June rolls around.
Indeed. I'll keep that in mind. All right. I was just thinking about when it comes to cucumbers. Yeah, as I'm not a big fan of pickles, I do like cucumbers. My maybe not so common use of cucumber that I really love is a gin and tonic with cucumber and black pepper, which I believe is the Hendrick's gin. That's their signature gin and tonic, and it's really, really refreshing.
Oh, I've never tried it with black pepper. I'm going to have to add that to my repertoire for the weekend.
Yeah, crack some black pepper over it, put a slice of cucumber in, really, really refreshing. Also, the Pim's Cup is a great beverage that has cucumber in it, so that's really fun.
Very cool.
Okay, let's get to that Bindrider pickle recipe. Tell me about it. Are you willing to share? I don't want to take family secrets away, but it sounds very enticing.
I am willing to share, and actually, so let me back up. One of the reasons that this recipe is also holds a very soft spot in my heart is because when I started growing a garden 5 or 6 years ago, I wanted to recreate this pickle recipe. And so I called my grandmother and I said, do you have Rosie's pickle recipe? And she said, well, I don't, but I'll give her a call and get it for you. And I have never been happier to miss a call from my grandmother in my life because she left me just the most charming voicemail.
Wonderful.
Where she relays the pickle recipe to me. And to this day, I have never written it down because instead of looking at a recipe card every year, I go back and I listen to this voicemail from my grandmother that shares this pickle recipe. So yeah, that's how I recreate it every year.
Okay, well, I think maybe on that note, then maybe are you willing to share that? Maybe instead of you telling us the recipe, maybe we can hear from your grandma.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, well, let's do that, and then we'll come back with a different plan.
Cool.
Audrey, I want to give you this recipe before I forget it. I'll give you a voicemail. 5 cups of water, 1/2 to 3/4 cup of vinegar, and 1/4 cup of salt. And she puts peppercorn in, and that boils. You have to boil all of that together. Then in each jar, she puts grated horseradish, and she puts a 1/2 teaspoon of turmeric, and she puts dill, and she just kind of puts whatever she wants in there, and then she put the pickles in and with and then you pour the boiling water over the pickles and everything else that's in there. And then that's it. She says, and she says you have to, she always didn't make that many. She says that would make about 3 jars. And she says you should leave them in the refrigerator. If you have any questions, give me a call. Bye.
Well, thank you, Audrey, for sharing about cucumbers and specifically pickles, and more specifically the Bindrider pickle with us. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Please do.
Awesome. So sometimes I try to make the plants that we talk about related to each other. I didn't do that this time. I picked a kind of entirely random plant that is not related to cucumbers in any way. But I was out in my yard, and this happens all the time. I'm like, what are you? And today it was some grass. I don't mow my lawn very regularly. I like to say it's for the pollinators, but it's also because I'm lazy.
Two things can be true.
Totally. And there was some grass that was getting pretty tall and was starting to get seed heads on it. And I was like, what are you? And it should have been obvious, I guess, because it's a very common grass, but it was Kentucky bluegrass.
Oh, cool.
So that's my plant that I'm going to choose today. And just first quiz here, where do you think Kentucky bluegrass is from?
Well, I guess the easy answer is Kentucky, but the fact that you're asking the question makes me think it's from Florida or something.
Yeah, it's actually from Europe and Asia.
Okay, that makes sense.
Which is interesting, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Because the story of how it became Kentucky Bluegrass is very interesting, but also a little bit still nebulous to me. I tried to do a bunch of research into this, and I got somewhere with it, but maybe not all the way. But let's talk a little bit more about it. First of all, just it's meaningful to me because it grows in my yard. That's like the easy answer for this one. It's there, but it's also like a pretty like prevalent plant in some other ways, which we'll talk about in a bit. But let's talk about a few other things. Okay, scientific name is Poa pratensis. Poa, the genus, is Greek, which means fodder, and pratensis means meadow. So it was in Europe and Asia. It is a very common fodder plant for livestock.
Okay.
So that's where its name comes from. But here it's just really called bluegrass and specifically Kentucky bluegrass. But I was like, well, I read that it's not from here. It's from Europe and Asia. And they don't call it Kentucky Blue. They must not call it Kentucky Bluegrass there,
right.
Even though like the Wikipedia page is Kentucky Bluegrass. So I translated it. Like I checked the Wikipedia page for some other languages and found some other places. So here's a few different names for it in a few European languages.
Okay.
In German, it is called Wiesenrispengras, which means meadow panicle grass. So panicles are like the little things where the seeds hang from. That's like a botany term. In French, I'm going to butcher this. It's called Pâturin des Prés, which I think also means something like meadow grass. And then in Spanish, I found Poa de los Prados, which means Poa of the meadows. And then in Dutch, it is Veldbeemdgras, which I didn't know what that translated to, but probably something similar to field grass or something. So anyway, it's a pretty common plant in Europe. It's like really common, but it is somehow come to be connected with Kentucky. Yep. Were you going to say something?
Well, so I'm just wondering if there's obviously a large agriculture and like horses are cultivated. They're
bred there. Yes.
Yeah, bred there. And because it's like a fodder grass, is that why it's so widespread in Kentucky?
Yes, it is definitely related to that. It was very like well thought. Let me see how I want to best weave this tale. So the area of there's an area of Kentucky that's called the Bluegrass region.
Okay.
And it's this area kind of in the northern part of the state where Frankfort is, the capital. And this region has this, pre-colonization, apparently it was a known as an oak savanna, this kind of area. So this savanna with lots of grasses and then spotted with very, sparsely separated oak trees. And then this is a little bit off topic, but it's a concept I'm really fascinated by. It was broken up by these things called cane brakes, which are these just massive, thick colonies of a river cane or a kind of cane. And it's kind of bamboo, but it's a bamboo native to North America. And this kind of ecology is almost extinct, the cane brake.
Huh.
But that used to be like how like large parts of the country were just like for miles and miles and miles. It was just like super, super thick cane. And it like held all sorts of interesting ecological purposes. But when, colonizers came in, that's really annoying because you really couldn't get through it. And so they're almost gone. And I was reading some interesting movements to try to like rebuild some. And, it used to be like 50,000 acres of cane.
Yeah.
And now I was reading they're like trying to restore 29 acres of cane in some places. And
wow.
Anyway, a little bit of a bummer as far as like why that went. But it's an interesting story of how you have this area that was like that, and in relatively short time is now known for the grass that is not from there.
Right. Right.
And it's because though that the land had really great soil, and so when farmers came in post the Revolutionary War. And they started growing all sorts of crops there. Tobacco, hemp apparently was really popular. They were growing, I think apparently the first vineyard in the United States was in that region.
No kidding.
And one of the things that makes the soil really good is that it's got a really high calcium content. And so people started noticing that the animals that were grazing there were stronger, particularly the horses, because there's more calcium and so their bones were stronger. And so that's also where the like reputation for thoroughbred horses came in, because feeding the horses this bluegrass that was being grown there made them stronger because the soil is much more high in calcium content.
Huh, no kidding.
Yeah, so I
That's
thought
really
that was
cool.
very, very fascinating. So it's pretty amazing how fast that area went from like not having this grass at all to like being known as bluegrass. And if some historians out there know more about this, I would love to know more. But I read that that people started moving to Kentucky really quickly after the Revolutionary War. Frankfort was founded in 1783, which was, I think, the same year the war ended, or don't quote me on these dates, but all around the same time. And then I found a Masonic review from 1858 that calls it the Bluegrass region already. So, 60, 70 years
Yeah.
from when presumably there wasn't a ton of bluegrass to being known as the Bluegrass region. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Is it considered an invasive species just based on how quickly it established itself and took over?
Yeah, definitely by some definitions, it
Yeah.
could be. But it's also a grass that we tend to love. Like, it is the most common grass in, like, lawn mixes. So that's the reason why it's in my yard. At some point, somebody planted grass seed, and there's a few different species. And it's also really common in sports fields. So some football stadiums use it. Some Major League Baseball use it. Some in Europe, it's really popular in soccer pitches. So it's, and so it's those grasses that, we don't consider things invasive if we like them, even though
right.
in the American lawn, I think could be considered. Most of those are invasive species if you think about them.
Since we moved into this house, I've been lifting a lot of sod and can confirm it is hard to get rid of grass once it's taken over and established.
Totally. So it's an interesting question. Like I am like slowly trying to get rid of my lawn, and I have a long-term goals of trying to replace everything in my yard with native plants, but it's a really hard challenge, super hard.
Yeah.
So yeah, whether it's invasive or not, that's open to interpretation. This is interesting. Before I get to the last little bit, do you know why it's called Kentucky bluegrass?
I do not. I was going to ask you if it once it goes to seed, does it turn blue?
You got it. This is so fascinating because I've seen it in like people's yards and stuff like that, and you're like, it just looks green. I mean, maybe if I'm thinking it's a little bit blue tinged, but I actually don't think so. It is the seed head has this kind of purpley blue quality. If you look up pictures online of the seed heads,
Cool.
But the way we use it, we never see that.
Right.
So like we know it's bluegrass, but nobody, at least like people who live in the city or the suburbs and aren't feeding it to animals, don't ever see the blue quality of the bluegrass, which is really fascinating.
And if you're grazing livestock, probably it wouldn't really get to the seed stage in that circumstance either, because they'd eat it down too quickly, right?
Yeah. I guess it depends on how you're managing it. Sometimes people like seed heads to let things go to seed because you can get
or like
more
pasture rotation, that kind of thing.
Right. On pasture rotation, I guess this is not 100% sure, but in some of the references I found, it seems like maybe bluegrass started to come in as a rotation crop for things like tobacco.
Oh, okay.
Like a multi-year rotation. It was like saying they would do tobacco and then clover and then bluegrass, and then once the bluegrass has been there for a few years, you can till it and do tobacco again. But maybe then the horses were eating it and like, man, these horses are strong. Oh, maybe we should stick with the bluegrass.
Man, it's funny how something that started off as something pretty ecologically sound with that kind of crop rotation can quickly become kind of a monoculture. Totally.
Very, very interesting stuff. So that, I think leads us to the other well-known definition of the word bluegrass, which I'm sure you can imagine what it is.
I would assume it's musical.
Indeed, bluegrass music. And so I didn't know, like, I mean, I knew it was related to Kentucky. I knew there was bluegrass in Kentucky, but, like, why is this music called bluegrass? And it turns out that is a pretty easy answer, and fans of bluegrass out there probably are shouting already. The answer to this is that there is the guy who is known to have invented this style is a guy named Bill Monroe, and his band was called Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys.
And
they were from Kentucky, and so he started playing this style of music that became really popular. His banjo player was a guy named Earl Scruggs, which really kind of popularized the style of bluegrass playing, of bluegrass banjo playing, and so it became very popular. And so other people started doing it, and they started referring it to bluegrass. So it's inspired by the name of the state and that region of the state. And he named his band the Bluegrass Boys, and so that's why it's known as bluegrass music. And it was around like the his band, I guess, was started in the late 30s, but really it was kind of late 40s into the 50s when it started to become, the word bluegrass music started to become known.
Sure.
Yeah.
Huh. So a relatively newer American genre of music, which is kind of fascinating.
It is. Yeah, you think about it, you might think about it as being much more old folk music. And the thing is, it kind of did exist for a longer time. The bluegrass music is inspired by like Scottish styles of music. It's music that came over from Scotland and then mixed with, the banjo is actually originally an African instrument that was kind of recreated by enslaved people based off of what they knew. And so it's kind of this mishmash that maybe was evolving as folk music for a long time. I was reading some stuff about how there's these kinds of music that would be based off of like, Scottish jigs and reels played at like barns, but, I think it was around the right time when just popular music was really popular, non-classical music, and the radio was starting to become a thing that you could create something called bluegrass based off of this folk music. So that's interesting. And also, bluegrass music also makes bluegrass meaningful to me because I'm from Texas. I've got a lot of Southern roots, and that kind of music has been around a lot and something I've listened to. And it's a cool style of music, and yeah, I like it a lot. So that's also why bluegrass is meaningful to me.
Well, it's interesting that it seems like bluegrass music has established itself with the same rapid pace that the actual Kentucky bluegrass established itself in Kentucky. So that sort of brings it full circle.
Indeed. I think we can just leave it there. That was a great way to wrap up the show.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Here's Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys.
That was Bluegrass Breakdown by Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys, the founder of the bluegrass genre. And now I'm going to take you on a bit of a tangent that's not really plant-related and is barely bluegrass-related, but it's something that came into my mind as I was thinking about bluegrass. So bear with me. So, as I mentioned before, I'm from Texas. I grew up in that area, and bluegrass is not from Texas, but there's a lot of bluegrass spread. And so I remember knowing about bluegrass from when I was pretty young and hearing bluegrass music. But when I think about the word bluegrass, the song that comes into my head is this one. Do you know it? So this is the theme for the movie Raising Arizona. And this is a movie that I really loved when I was a kid, when I first watched it. I loved it much later, maybe in high school, when I really started to appreciate it more. And this is the theme song that happens throughout the movie. And I thought that, my thinking always was that this was some kind of old bluegrass song that they used for the movie. But it turns out that's actually composed by Carter Burwell. He's the prolific composer who composed all of the Coen Brothers movies. He also composed music for tons of other movies. He's really prolific. And he wrote this song, which is called Way Out There. And it's a really great bluegrass tune, but it was made just for the movie, which is kind of an interesting choice because, Arizona's not necessarily what you think of when you think of bluegrass. But as we learned in the episode, that part of Kentucky wasn't always what you thought of when you thought of bluegrass, bluegrass being from Europe. But anyway, so I was thinking about this. I was reading about this song, and it's a really interesting story. The guy who played the banjo on this was a guy named Ben Freed. And he was actually a optometrist from New York City, which is not what you'd expect when you think of a banjo player, particularly a bluegrass banjo player. But this is a guy who got really into bluegrass banjo when he was really young, and he kept with it his whole life, and he was really well respected as being a really great banjo player, in addition to an optometrist. And I think he even knew the Coen Brothers, because maybe he was their optometrist. At least that's what I read on Carter Burwell's webpage. So that's the story of the song. But then I started thinking about the movie Raising Arizona, and I'm going to spoil the ending to Raising Arizona right now. So be warned if you haven't seen this over 35-year-old film. I'm going to spoil the ending. But I mentioned how I remember seeing this movie as a kid and really liking it. I remember seeing it in high school, and when I was starting to get into film, my background is in filmmaking, starting to realize, oh, the Coen Brothers are great, and this is a really great example. It's a really cool movie. But I recently just watched this movie again, and now that I have a kid, it really hit different, and I wasn't expecting that, and particularly the end of the movie. And so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to play this last little monologue from Nicolas Cage's character, H.I. McDonough, and he's talking about his wife, Ed, and short for Edwina, and he's talking about a dream he has at the end of the film. And yeah, watching this, which is, it's a comedy movie, but watching this more recently had me pretty emotional. And so I don't know if it's got the same effect on you, but that's what we're going to do to end the show. I'm just going to play this segment from the movie Raising Arizona. If you haven't seen it, spoiler alert, like I said, but I think it's fair. It's been out for a long time. But here we go, and then we will end the show.
But still, I hadn't dreamt nothing about me and Ed until the end. And this was cloudier, because it was years away. But I saw an old couple being visited by their children, and all their grandchildren, too. And the old couple wasn't screwed up, and neither were their kids or their grandkids.
Dad.
And I don't know. You tell me, this whole dream, was it wishful thinking? Was I just fleeing reality like I know I'm liable to do? But me and Ed, we can be good too. And it seemed real. It seemed like us. And it seemed like, well, our home. If not Arizona, then a land not too far away, where all parents are strong and wise and capable, and all children are happy and beloved. I don't know. Maybe it was Utah.
My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Audrey Houseman. Audrey is a marketer and political strategist in Akron, Ohio. You can follow her adventures in Lake House homesteading at Teal House on the Hill on Instagram. There will be a link in the show notes. If you are a fan of this podcast and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to see how you can help us out, including supporting the show on Patreon. I would be so appreciative. Rootbound is hosted by Bluegrass boy Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegaskota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, you could pick a peck of pickling cucumbers and try your hand at the Bindrider pickle.
Pollination, the birds and the bees of plants.